Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to another Tabadlab Live. Today, I'm joined by one of the most important researchers on anything and everything to do with how China engages with the rest of the world, but particularly its aid and loan and debt sort of negotiations and relationships with the rest of the world. Uh, as many of you will already know, Pakistan and China share a deep and abiding bilateral relationship that spans almost every imaginable issue. And in recent years, this relationship has become the target of a lot of cynicism and criticism, both in the West, which of course is predisposed to criticism of anything China does, but also, I think, genuinely, some exploration and questions about whether this specific relationship, the China-Pakistan relationship, is as advertised. And what that means is Pakistan getting the kind of value from the relationship and the various aspects of the relationship that it should be. One important aspect of this relationship that, again, in the Western academia and Western press has had huge coverage is the China-Pakistan economic corridor and the loan or debt element of this. Now, the reason this is important, I think, for people that are interested in Pakistani public policy is that Pakistan does have an enduring and ongoing debt crisis. The Tabadlab is working on Pakistan's external debt issues separately. We've had many conversations, and I would urge viewers interested in that to look at some of the conversations we've had with Murtaza Sayyed, with Khurram Hussain, with Mahin Rahman, talking about the nature of Pakistan's debt sustainability over the past year and a half in particular. But today, we're joined by a scholar, an academic, and a researcher. His name is Dr. Ammar Malik. Ammar, I'm grateful. This is not your first time at the Tabadlab, and hopefully not your last. Ammar is a visiting fellow at the Tabadlab, and we're very excited about some of the conversations we've been having about his original area of passion and interest, which is the way in which cities work and how they develop over time and what they mean for human advancement, especially in countries in the so-called global south. So Ammar, first of all, just to say thank you for doing this.
Musharraf.
And second, just to recast and kind of reframe today's conversation, what I wanted to do today was really talk to you about your ongoing research on the AidData platform and what you guys have been doing, but specific to I was about to say the Chakistan, which would be an interesting new place, but for now, the Pakistan-China aid and debt relationship. One obvious and immediate concern is it too much? Is it sustainable? Is it exploitative? And why should other countries be bailing out essentially China when Pakistan gets in trouble? So that's kind of the broad frame, but let me start with maybe asking you, is this the right way to frame this conversation? Is there a China-Pakistan debt corridor?
Musharraf, it's true that like many developing countries, Pakistan is in need of infrastructure, and large infrastructure projects like energy and highways requires big scale financing, and that financing has to come from external sources. Of course, we all know that the original theory of change behind the CPEC was to remove bottlenecks in Pakistan's energy sector and transportation sector in particular. And the idea was that that would lead to greater economic growth, and that would enable job creation, and therefore we will be able to take care of any and all debt that comes out of it. What has happened, however, is that those the second order benefits that were supposed to accrue to Pakistan's economy as a result of those original investments that China has made in energy and transportation, that has not taken place. And we can talk at length about the reasons for it, but it's because of that fundamental lack of translation into economic benefits that we are in the situation that we're in.
So it's interesting you say that, as we've discussed many times privately as well. To my mind, 2012, 2013, 2014, Pakistan had a very simple problem that it wanted to solve. Pakistan did not have enough energy generation capacity to meet its needs, especially in the summers. That problem could have been solved in the best way possible. And I don't know what that is, but the way it was solved was not the best way possible because there are many critiques of the way it was solved. The only thing that I'm certain about is that without Chinese financing, whatever solution we have, extra good, okay, good, not good, bad, however we want to judge it, but the solution that we have would not have been possible. I think that's exactly what
That's right. Not only that, China came to Pakistan's energy sector in a big way. When we do the numbers at AidData, we find that the $28 billion that China has spent on Pakistan's energy sector from 2000 to 2021 is in fact the single biggest energy portfolio that China has put together anywhere in the world. And it has come through a variety of instruments, but I think it's important to remember that all of that investment came through the IPP or the power policy that Pakistan has had since the 1990s. And of course, a lot of these debts were brought to Pakistan through special purpose vehicles and joint ventures that were created. And the government of Pakistan had to both guarantee really high returns on equity that was brought in for these projects. And on the loans, the interest rates, again, were commercial interest rates, LIBOR plus 2.3%, which is the London interbank rate, plus 2 or 3% margin. And the government of Pakistan had to write sovereign guarantees, which means that if these projects go belly up, the government would be on the hook to repay them. And we can talk at length about the structural problems in this policy, but I think the Chinese basically followed the instructions that were given to them by the government at the highest levels and came through and delivered really high capacity production. The problem, however, is that Pakistan's energy distribution system is inefficient. And the political economy, as we all know well, is such that it's very difficult to reform this sector. I'm talking about the distribution companies and so on. And that's where I think the attention has to be now.
So I think this is a brilliant way of framing it, that essentially the way in which this has happened, the way in which Pakistan has used these loans is a separate conversation from the fact that these loans were not forthcoming from anywhere else. So not with no prejudice to the IPP structures, to the nature of the loans, to the interest rates, to the commercial or non-commercial nature. The fact is that even at these, let's say that these loans were all exploitative, just for argument's sake. Even at these so-called exploitative terms, the only lender that was willing to come up and put money into this venture were the Chinese. Is that accurate?
I think that's what I've heard from the horse's mouth, as they say. But it's also true that not only was China able to provide the financing for this, but critically, they had the ability to implement these projects in record time. Some of the coal-fired power plants that were created between 2014 and 2016 were done in 28 to 30 months, brought online within 30 months. And that sort of speed is the hallmark of the Chinese state-owned commercial enterprise sector, where the financing and the construction capacity all comes as a package. And that is also part of the equation that was offered by the Chinese that simply wasn't available elsewhere, I'm told.
When you talk about that package, I think there's one other element that, at least in the West, and you're based in the US and at William and Mary, which is a fantastic sort of liberal arts school in Virginia. I think oftentimes when we hear about packages, the one part of the package that doesn't get talked about a lot in Pakistan or in Beijing, perhaps, is that, okay, you get the money and you get the expertise, but then you also get kind of a dependency or some sort of a political quid pro quo. Is there anything in the research that you've done, the AidData evidence and the research and the insights that you have, that suggests that that third package is something that is part of what other countries are sort of having to deal with?
One of the chapters in our latest report called Belt and Road Reboot talks about what we call reputational side of things, or the soft power. And we do this by looking at public opinion through Gallup World Polls, media sentiment, and UN General Assembly voting pattern. Long story short, Musharraf, when we put the entire developing world where China has a footprint on a distribution, what we find is if you look at the scale of Chinese funding, 2/3 of Chinese money goes into countries which are in the competitive space, what we call toss-up countries. Whereas the countries
Competitive space between whom?
between the United States and China.
Okay.
Pakistan, of course, is in what we would call a safe bet category for China. In other words, the gap between favorability in the Pakistani public sphere for China versus the US is large. It's a 60 percentage point gap. So Pakistanis are incredibly pro-China. Pakistan's media is also somewhat pro-China. And so what that tells me is that there is a nervous system in place in Beijing that is keeping an eye on their soft power developments, both positive and negative, and responding.
Or, I mean, just for argument's sake, could it also be, because I don't know if correlation and causation here are it would be accurate, but couldn't it also be possible that China's relationship decision-making is hinged partly on their assessment, and that the positive sentiment for China is a pre-existing factor that makes China feel more comfortable in engaging with Pakistan in this way? Is that also plausible?
Both things go hand in hand, but it's very obvious, even if it's a correlation, when we look at the early BRI years and the late BRI years, we look at the sentiments in the early years and we look at the responses in the late years. When Beijing faces headwinds like they did in Zambia, their strategy is to lay low. When Zambia started having trouble repaying their loans in 2018, prior to their default in 2020, they literally stopped making new commitments. But when they had tailwinds behind them, like in Bangladesh, they've been on an upstream role in terms of media sentiment and so on.
So that means that there is a Chinese sensitivity to criticism and critique. You mentioned Zambia, so because of the part of the topic of our conversation is debt, and I'm really interested in linking this element of the debt thing to the wider debt picture in Pakistan. Like I said, we're working on that. Ammar Khan and Zishan are working on that. You're familiar with that work, and we'll be releasing that work, inshallah, in the coming days and weeks. But one sort of sudden, immediate question I have is on Sri Lanka, because the theory was that the Chinese did a big Sri Lankan CPEC, if you will, or CSEC, or whatever you want to call it. There was the Hambantota port investment, there was airports, there was roads, there was power as well. But then when push came to shove and Sri Lanka, I think COVID was very unkind to Sri Lanka in particular, because basically the tourism hit on Sri Lanka was so substantial that it really altered politics and economy there. So why didn't the Chinese kind of rush to Sri Lanka's aid? Is Sri Lanka an outlier in terms of what you see? Because they didn't lie low. They kind of just, from my understanding, the Chinese kind of just stepped back without lying low, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think the dynamic in Sri Lanka is very interesting, and it's instructive for Pakistan. And I say this because China was not the single largest player in Sri Lanka's debt crisis. What you have to remember is that when a country defaults and they start talking about restructuring debt or renegotiating debt, the coordination among the creditors is critical. Usual practice prior to 2000, 2010 was that the Paris Club creditors, which is the group of rich Western countries, come together and they take haircuts in equal proportions. It's called an equality principle. China is not part of the Paris Club. They've been invited many times to participate in it. They have not done it. And what we are seeing time and time again, Zambia, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, is that China wants to work bilaterally with a government, cut their own deal, but that creates a moral hazard problem for the rest of the creditors. And so it is that coordination among the donors that delayed the Zambia debt deal, and the same dynamic played out in Sri Lanka. It always becomes the stumbling block. So China's strategy globally, as I see it, is on the one hand, cut deals bilaterally, but on the other hand, they're also making it clear that they would only give bailout loans or rescue loans, like they've given us in Pakistan, to countries which are in good standing with the IMF. That is a stated Chinese policy, and that makes the dynamic even more interesting.
So, Doc, I mean, maybe I'd frame it like that's interesting, but I'd frame it maybe differently and say, essentially, this is China. China's not causing these countries to go into default or to seek, debt relief necessarily. I mean, China's basically saying, we're not going to play ball with the Paris Club, because in a sense, that would be like accepting, like the Paris Club is an interesting framing of, it's really the Washington, D.C. club. And so obviously, with U.S.-China competition, they're not going to do that. What this means, though, I guess, for a country like Pakistan, is that then it has to negotiate with a whole range of different uh, entities and actors, because we have people who hold bonds, we have the multilaterals, then you have the Paris Club countries, and then you have China. Now, in the case of Sri Lanka, you said China wasn't the biggest holder of debt. Is China the biggest holder of debt for Pakistan?
Uh, to the best of my knowledge, the answer is no. According to AidData's estimates, Pakistan has $67 billion in public and publicly guaranteed debt, which is about 20% of GDP. And that means that China is not the single largest player. In fact, if you look at the official books of the government of Pakistan, Chinese debt is parked in different categories. Chinese debt is parked in official creditor category through the policy bank loans.
That's what we call bilateral.
That's
straight.
bilateral.
Yeah.
But AidData follows the definitions of the OECD's creditor reporting system, according to which if an entity is official sector, in other words, it's an official sector state-owned commercial bank like ICBC or Bank of China, we define it as public debt.
Is the CIDC also part of that?
I'm not familiar with that particular
Sorry,
bank.
the Chinese International Development.
Sitka, you mean?
That's right, yeah.
In fact, Musharraf, what you have to remember is that Sitka is a very small player in the grand scheme of things.
Okay.
If you look at the world over, only 5% or up to 10% of Chinese overseas aid and credit for development is in the form of what we call ODA or grants or aid.
Okay.
Sitka is the $5 billion budget per year globally, and that makes them like a Sweden or a Norway, a small or mid-size player
Right.
in global development.
But in terms of OECD's categorization, that would be part and parcel of the CIBC and the other. Are there 3 entities that make these kinds of loans in China?
No, this is, in fact, globally, we have found almost 800 official sector entities from China.
No, but the big ones are, there's...
The big ones are the policy banks, China Exim Bank and China Development Bank.
Okay.
And then there are the large commercial banks, such as ICBC and Bank of China, that do syndicated loans and other infrastructure financing. But the other big player is SAFE, which is the State Agency for Foreign Exchange Management. China has such large foreign exchange reserves that this entity is in the business of giving out deposits in dollars, but also they are the ones who work with the Central Bank of China to give out what we call debt swaps. And Pakistan has drawn billions of dollars worth of debt swaps, but always in yuan or renminbi, which is another strategy that the Chinese are following globally to try to bail out countries which are facing debt distress, and they're doing this with renminbi-denominated loans, not dollar-denominated loans.
Okay, so without getting into the judgment of whether an alternative currency is a good idea, I think there's some obvious reasons why it's a great idea, and then there's other questions around it. But it sounds to me, from what you're saying, is that it's very hard to get a handle on all the debt that Pakistan owes China. Is that what the AidData studies have found?
I would say that we know about the full extent of all of the activities that have taken place. I mean, it's all in the public realm. What is challenging is the definitional bit.
Okay.
Because officially, Pakistani government, like all members of the World Bank Group, are obligated to report all their debts to the International Debt Statistics Office of the World Bank. And when you compare the debt numbers that Pakistan puts out itself with what AidData finds from our research and what the IDS has put out, those numbers are hard to reconcile. And
how big is the gap?
I think the gap, I mean, Pakistan has no hidden debt from China, which is a common thing that we find. Pakistan's debt levels, I think, are fairly consistent across IDS and the estimates of AidData. However, what is challenging is how we report these debts as what is commercial, what's not commercial, what's officially obligated. And the other thing you have to remember is when you look at the Ministry of Finance statistical supplements or debt supplements, they do not report the debt swaps that Pakistan has taken out through the State Bank of Pakistan. And in my estimates, there's at least $10 billion worth of that. And the mechanism there is that every year since 2017-18, Pakistan has been drawing 20 or 30 billion yuan worth of renminbi. and then using it for all sorts of activities. And that doesn't get officially reported. And that's because the IDS of the World Bank doesn't require Pakistan or other members to report any debt as public debt, which is less than 12 months in duration. And what ends up happening is that if the debt or a deposit like we get from Saudi Arabia or from China is less than 12 months in duration, we don't report it, and then we keep getting rollovers. And on average, we are finding it's 3 to 6 years is actually the term of a loan, which is short-term given, but it doesn't have to be reported. So there is a problem in the debt reporting system that the World Bank manages, and they're aware of that.
So, I mean, maybe the problem is in that system, but it sounds to me like something is changing in Pakistan's own debt profile. And I wonder how much of it is because of China or because of the loans that that Pakistan has taken from China or that China has given to Pakistan. I guess my question is it that the term of these loans that are being taken now and the rates at which those loans are being taken have changed in the last sort of 3-4 years? Because I always find criticism of CPEC to be really problematic. Nobody else was coming with the money for CPEC. And CPEC wasn't just expensive IPPs, it was also, I think, cheap infrastructure, especially compared to what we have right now. Exactly, physical road infrastructure in particular. But the other thing that seems to be happening is that the loans that Pakistan is taking now are not for building stuff.
Correct.
So what is happening?
This is a microcosm of what we are seeing the world over, actually. So consider a couple of statistics. Today, if you look at China's portfolio of Belt and Road projects around the world, 80% of the countries that have that money are in debt distress, and 55% of the loans are due for repayment. And that percentage is going to go up to 75%. So China is basically dealing with a $1 trillion debt collection effort around the world. And what's happening in Pakistan is exactly what they're doing around the world, which is to do what we call firefighting. What I mean by that is that countries like Pakistan that took large energy infrastructure loans 5 or 6 years ago, they had these 5 or 7 year grace periods before which repayments are not due. You just pay a little bit, you keep the system running.
And the logic was solid then, wasn't it? You're going to make this investment, you have the grace period to build up, and then when you start drawing the benefits from this, you'll have no problem paying off them. Is that the logic?
That's exactly how it was structured. However, the problem is that the exchange rate risk was taken by the government of Pakistan. We sell electricity to the people of Pakistan in rupees through a highly inefficient system of distribution, and the returns have to go out in dollars. All of this is fully transparent. It's on the energy regulator's website, and anybody can see it. So the strategy that China is following, which is why we at AidData call it firefighting, is that they are giving out large renminbi denominated and dollar denominated loans, liquidity injections, to let countries like Pakistan and Argentina or Bangladesh and others to repay the loans that they had taken from Chinese and other entities, just to keep the system afloat. But my worry, Musharraf, is that this is a replay of the 1980s debt crisis, where the US was indulging in exactly the same strategy in Latin America. Eventually, they had to come up with something called the Brady Plan, where the banks had to give in and they had to restructure this. So this debt issue globally is ballooning, and Pakistan is no exception.
So because of the COVID and the post-COVID spike in interest rates, which of course didn't have anything to do with the virus, but did have to do with the way in which liquidity was kind of just unleashed during COVID to deal with the crisis. We now have a situation, if I understand you correctly, where the reasonable loans, let's assume, just work with me for a second, the reasonable loans for productive purposes that were taken in 2014, 15, and 16 are now due for repayment, but there's not enough money because we had COVID and things got screwed up. In Pakistan, there was obviously the political crisis of 2022 in particular. So you had all of this happen, and now those loans are due, but there's no money to pay it. So now the government of Pakistan is borrowing at much higher interest rates for much shorter periods of time to pay off lower interest rate loans. Is this not clearly unsustainable?
Absolutely, it is. And at a superficial level, China is bailing out Pakistan by providing these short-term liquidity injections. Saudi Arabia is part of it. The IMF is in the mix as well. But at a deeper level, if you think about it, Chinese banks are bailing out themselves in order to keep their own loans from remaining current in terms of their repayment obligation. So I agree with you. I think this is Pakistan is hovering on the brink of being unsustainable in its debt, and I think the new work that you all are about to put out is going to demonstrate that even more clearly.
Right. I mean, thanks for the, spoiler alert there. But I mean, it's not a spoiler. I think that's the point, that it's very obvious. Now, when this issue is talked about, my worry is that there's a bit of an unfair framing, and I think you dealt with that already. Look, the terms of these loans, Pakistan was completely sovereign and free to negotiate them. And the IPP policy predates CPEC by at least a decade and a half.
Right.
So would it be fair to say that Pakistan's debt sustainability crisis is the product of Chinese debt to Pakistan?
There's two parties to every agreement, Musharraf. And
Right.
one thing that we know about China all over the world is that they are an incredibly demand-responsive donor. They don't even bring their own standards and values in anything. They just sit across the table and say, what do you need? And that's certainly what happened in Pakistan. Energy was top of the agenda. If you remember, the 2013 elections was won by the PMLN, largely on agenda of ending load shedding in Pakistan. And they delivered to a large extent on that promise, thanks to all this injection of capacity that China provided. So as I said earlier at the start of this discussion, the problem was not so much in the design of this framing. The problem was how it would then translate into benefits. And today it looks like it was a bad idea, but in hindsight, I don't think there were any other takers at that time.
I think the other part of this is, now, if we move to kind of the solutions end of the conversation, I just want to go back to this Sri Lanka crisis,
Right.
where you have China on one side that's saying, we'll help out Sri Lanka, but we're only interested in helping out Sri Lanka on our terms. On the other hand, you have the Paris Club countries saying, if you want to solve a debt crisis, we all have to be together on this so that there's equality. That's the principle you sort of mentioned. We all give up a little bit of what this country owes to us, but we agree to do it together. And China's saying, we're not going to be part of that. Now, in this standoff, time is being lost. And so do you see any different path for Pakistan? I think the stakes for both the West and for China in Pakistan's case are even more clearly drawn. My own, and again, I mean, this conversation is about what you think, so I'll forget what I think. Tell me, do you see any chance of China and the Paris Club countries getting together, or finding a way around this issue of kind of equality of the haircut, if you will?
This is one of the big questions, Musharraf, and I get asked this question all the time in Washington. What is China going to do with Pakistan? Because the size of China's exposure to Pakistan is huge. The world talks a lot about African countries, but remember, Zambia, Uganda, these are small projects that you can fit in 10, 15 of these into one CPEC or one Pakistan. I think China obviously has a special strategic interest in Pakistan, and to keep Pakistan afloat, keep Pakistan relatively stable. And I've heard in my meetings in Islamabad that it looks likely that the ML1, the biggest of all CPEC projects, the mainline one projects, which would be worth $6-7 billion, might actually go ahead in the future if there is political stability in this country. So China has given like a steady hand to Pakistan so far. But my worry is that if the conditions of our debt remain as precarious as they are, that will really deter China from making more productive investments in the country, because it's all unprotected debt that we're taking on. Since 2018, if you look at the numbers that AidData has put out, the majority of financing coming from China to Pakistan is for unproductive, what we call emergency loans.
Or what we also call rollovers, essentially?
Rollovers is part of it.
Okay.
In fact, if you don't even count rollovers, still the majority of the funding is in the form of short-term liquidity.
So what Pakistan is doing more generically, of course, we know this from our own research, and again, you've been really helpful in that. We know that Pakistan's been borrowing money to pay off money that it borrowed before for several years now.
Right.
I think the more worrying thing is the rate of interest and the term. And I guess from the AidData evidence, the fact that China is stuck in Pakistan in the way it is makes Pakistan a unique case study for your research?
At the global scale, Musharraf, I have no doubt that CPEC is the flagship of the Belt and Road, which means that if, God forbid, CPEC fails or Pakistan defaults or goes down in a negative direction, then China's entire global offering on the Belt and Road is at stake. So that, in other words, it reminds me of 20 years ago when we were talking Pakistan is too big to fail. In a way, we've again come to that point where we're too big to fail.
Well, but could it also be that kind of, when you're pointing one finger at somebody, you're pointing four, or three at yourself? Isn't it also the case that because Pakistan is the flagship for China's external engagement on aid and development, but if China was to afford Pakistan, special treatment that was obviously a haircut and obviously concessional beyond whatever concessions Pakistan already enjoys, that would set a precedent because it's such a prominent example.
Yep.
And so there's an internal, you're right, I can see, and I'm sure viewers can see that China has an incentive to make things work and to keep Pakistan, solvent and stable. But at the same time, China has no incentive to signal to another 50 countries that, hey, don't worry about your negotiation capacity or the way you spend money, because when push comes to shove, we're not going to let you fly off the cliff here.
Absolutely. It's a very important question, actually. This is why AidData's Chinese Development Finance Program exists, because we are one of the few data sets that fully disclose the terms and conditions of thousands, not hundreds, but thousands of Chinese loans all over the world. China does not voluntarily disclose the details of these loans in any aid transparency initiative. And I think one of the reasons why there is a policy from Beijing is so that, for the reasons that you just described, because they don't want to set a precedence. We, however, believe that it is very important to increase transparency about these things, because countries need to know, and the public needs to know what they are on the hook for eventually to repay the loans that their government is taking.
Again, I think that transparency should work across the board in 360 degrees. But let me ask you this, based on now, this is the second major kind of wave of AidData's research on this. And when you did the first wave, we were lucky to have you and talk to us and explain this. I want to maybe ask you to make like a prediction. I know that academics kind of shy away from this. What do you think is going to happen? Because if the debt is broadly unsustainable, then things are going to come to a head. So when they do come to a head, do you see China as being the player that's going to provide that soft landing for Pakistan in a substantive way that kind of ends the aid or the debt crisis? Or do you see a scenario in which you'll see more of what we have right now, which is kind of essentially the idea of rolling it over and just buying a little more time and kicking the can down the road a little bit? And then the third scenario is that at some point China kind of says, at least for us, if someone's going to bail out Pakistan, it's going to be the Paris Club countries. We're not going to actually continue either rolling over or doing some major restructuring, and we'll let Pakistan default and take things from there. So of those three scenarios, what do you see as being the most likely?
I think in Pakistan's case, it's likely to be the second situation, where there is temporary relief given. Maybe there could be some reprofiling of debt. They may not call it restructuring, we may call it reprofiling. We may get a holiday on payments like we did as part of the DSSI common framework, as they call it, during COVID, in which China did actually participate with Western countries to give all developing countries a pause on debt repayment. So there could be solutions, patchwork like that. But my sense is that China's orientation fundamentally is commercial in nature. These commercial banks and the entities that are operating here, delivering projects, are doing it as companies, as corporations, who are answerable ultimately to their shareholders. And I think we have to get used to this sort of orientation. I think they will keep Pakistan afloat. I think they will want things to move forward. But the situation is such that I don't see the West and China cooperating on a big debt renegotiation process with Pakistan or any other country for that matter. And that's my biggest worry. I think what the risk that Pakistan faces is that this whole competition between the US and China or West and China, if it plays out in the boardrooms of the IMF over Pakistan's next IMF program, which, as we all know, is inevitable, that's going to come through, I think that would be a nightmare scenario for Pakistan, and Pakistan needs to act tactfully to avoid that situation from emerging.
I think on that, I think dark prognosis, maybe we call it a day for this conversation, Dr. Ammar Malik. As always, I kind of end up getting smarter every time I talk to you. I hope those that had a chance to listen in and view this feel the same way. Really grateful. And of course, we'll be engaging a lot more, inshallah, in the next weeks and months as we talk more about this debt crisis and your wise counsel on the way forward and the analysis that the AidData database provides to all of us that are interested in evidence will be crucial and critical for us moving forward. So thank you for all the amazing work you do, and thanks for this conversation.
Thank you very much, Musharraf. I think you're filling a very important gap in developing an understanding of these issues and situating Pakistan in the global context. I think the least that we can do, both on the government side but also in private conversations in Pakistan, is to develop a more nuanced understanding of what we are facing and what China's strategies are and around the world. And I think we can only get better at dealing with this crisis if we know what's going on around the world. So thank you for inviting me, and I look forward to more conversations in the future.
Thanks a lot, Ammar. We'll talk to you again very soon, inshallah. Thanks for joining us.